Hey guys, tonight we begin with the clink of wooden mugs, the scent of barely scrubbed floors, and the gentle hum of a world that found creative ways to wake up feeling not quite sober. We're heading back to the Middle Ages, not for a joust or a plague this time, but for a toast to the intoxicating habits of the past. So before you drift off, imagine the morning sun slanting through a smoky common room, a peasant lad already on his third mug of ale, and a monk in the corner quietly sipping something far stronger than tea. Tonight we explore what getting high was like in medieval times. Let's start fittingly with breakfast. Now you might imagine medieval folks beginning their day with porridge a blessing, and maybe a light jog around the moat. But no, many of them, especially in Northern Europe, began the day with a drink. Not water, which was suspect and often dangerous, but beer. Beer was safe, comforting, and frankly expected. And we're not talking just one mug either. We're talking breakfast beer. The drink of choice was called small beer, a weak, lightly fermented brew with low alcohol content. Think of it as the medieval version of flavored water, but with enough booze to make you forget that you were about to spend the next 12 hours threshing wheat or digging a latrine. Even children drank it. It wasn't about catching a buzz most of the time. It was about hydration, calories, and maybe just a hint of numbness before heading off to manual labor in a field you didn't own. Of course not. All medieval beer was weak. Some batches were stronger, especially the ones monks brewed, and sometimes that breakfast beer came from a batch that had accidentally fermented a little too long. But hey, who's complaining? If your day involved chasing pigs or dodging arrows, a bit of early morning cheer might have felt downright medicinal. Alcohol wasn't just for peasants either. In noble households, morning drinking was ritualized. Lords and ladies would start their day with wine diluted with water, or perhaps some mead if they were feeling a little Viking. It was expected, it was respectable. And yes, it often meant that your average baron was tipsy by brunch. This practice of early morning drinking was so widespread that it shows up in literature, sermons, and even laws. In 13th century England, the assize of bread and ale regulated the price and quality of beer. Not out of concern for public health, mind you, but because people drank so much of it, they wanted to make sure it wasn't a scam. And the taverns? Oh, they opened early. Some were little more than someone's kitchen with extra benches and a big vat of questionable ale, but they were the social hubs of towns and villages. You could wander in at sunrise, sit beside a blacksmith, a thief, and maybe a bishop in disguise, and get your buzz on before the church bells rang. There was also the ritual of the alewife, a woman who brewed and sold beer out of her home. These women were both respected and feared. Respected because they provided an essential service. Feared because some of their stronger brews could drop a grown man faster than a bad batch of mutton. Interestingly, this casual early morning drinking didn't carry the same stigma it might today. You weren't seen as lazy or decadent. If anything, it was practical. Alcohol was cleaner than water. It preserved calories, and it made the drudgery of medieval life a little more bearable. After all, if your toilet was a wooden box over a stream, and your boss carried a sword, wouldn't you drink before work? But it wasn't all sunshine and barley. Heavy drinking did have its critics. Clergy often condemned morning drunkards in sermons, especially those who skipped mass to sleep off a hangover. Chronic inebriation could ruin reputations, destroy livelihoods, and land people in the stocks. And while taverns were a place for camaraderie, they were also breeding grounds for brawls, gossip, and the occasional stabbing over who really won the dice game. Still, the culture of morning drinking persisted. It was too embedded in daily life to go away. Monks wrote down brewing recipes. Farmers kept barrels beside their beds. And entire festivals were built around the joy of communal intoxication. Imagine waking up for a harvest feast, downing a few horns of ale, and then heading off to watch a goat juggling competition. That was Tuesday. Even medicine got in on the act. Physicians of the day often prescribed wine or beer for ailments ranging from headaches to heartbreak. A little drink in the morning. Why, that was preventative care. So as you nestle deeper into your pillow, imagine a world where the sunrise didn't mean coffee, but clinking mugs and giggling peasants. A world where hair of the dog wasn't a remedy, it was the entire breakfast menu. And as we drift forward, keep your tankard ready, because the medieval day was long, hard, and very, very blurry. Once breakfast drinking was out of the way, and it usually was by about the time a rooster gave up and went back to sleep, the tavern didn't close. No, no. It warmed up. In the Middle Ages, a tavern wasn't just a place to guzzle ale and swap sheep-related gossip. It was the heart of pharmacological experimentation, the neighborhood watering hole, and occasionally an accidental chemistry lab. This was especially true when the tavern keeper had an extra flair for herbs, imported spices, or borrowed recipes from monks who maybe weren't using them anymore. Some of the most intoxicating concoctions weren't labeled as drugs. They were called tonics cordials or restorative elixirs. But trust me, many of them packed a punch stronger than a mug of straight gin. Take wormwood, for instance. This bitter herb was popular in various liquors and medicinal brews. You might recognize it as the key ingredient in absinthe, the green fairy's drink of choice from a much later century. But medieval folks were already boiling it down and mixing it into their wine or ale. It was bitter, yes, and it did not taste like joy. But people swore it invigorated the blood-boosted digestion, and perhaps whispered secret poems to your brain when no one else was looking. And then there was hyssop sage and yarrow, common additions to tavern brews that weren't just there for flavor. These herbs were thought to purify the body and the soul, or at the very least, provide the drinker with a slightly wobbly sense of clarity. Some tavern owners leaned into this and advertised their brews as remedies. Was your head foggy? Did your knees ache? Was your heart heavy with regret after falling into a well again? Drink up. Of course, the line between medicine and recreation was delightfully blurry. Just because something was called a cure didn't mean people weren't drinking it purely for the warm, fuzzy effects. Medieval apothecaries were keenly aware that clients liked feeling relieved, and if relief came with mild hallucinations, who was going to complain? But the real stars of the medieval tavern were the spiced wines. Known in Latin as vinum conditum or claritum, these were wines steeped with cinnamon cloves, nutmeg, and sometimes dried flowers or fruit. Not only did these drinks smell amazing, but they also masked the taste of cheap or sour wine. Spices were expensive, and to the average person, sipping clove-spiked wine felt exotic, like drinking the essence of a faraway land. They were also mood-altering. Some of those spices especially in large quantities, had mild psychoactive effects. Medieval party tip: don't over nutmeg your wine unless you want to spend the evening believing your goat can talk. Interestingly, some taverns acted as quiet testing grounds for these blends. Recipes were traded, hoarded, and occasionally stolen. A particularly strong or enlightening batch of ale could make a tavern famous for miles around, and word spread fast, especially if someone saw angels after 3 mugs. This is where we meet the unofficial mixologists of the Middle Ages, tavern keepers, brewers, and herbalists who straddle the line between bartender and wizard. These folks often had a basic knowledge of what herbs did what, and they were not above experimenting on their patrons. Want to calm a nervous traveler? Add valerian root. Want to liven up a gloomy feast? Sprinkle in a little thyme and maybe some rosemary. Want to make sure no one remembers this wedding? Nutmeg again. Always nutmeg. And let's not forget honey. Sweet, glorious honey. It was used to ferment mead and to sweeten harsh wines, but it also helped mask the bitterness of stronger herbs. A tavern keeper with a steady supply of honey could turn even the roughest potion into something palatable. This wasn't just clever, it was profitable. People would line up for the tavern's special morning cordial, which suspiciously looked and smelled like hot wine with a dash of who knows what. Taverns also functioned as informal hospitals. Yes, really. If you were suffering from heartbreak headaches or had stubbed your toe trying to sneak into the monastery garden, chances are someone would direct you to the nearest inn, not a doctor. You'd be handed a mug of something murky and told to drink it slowly. Sleep, my friend, they'd say, as the concoction slid down your throat like a spiced brick of fire and forgiveness. And it wasn't just herbs and wine. Fermented fruit juice, herbal, distillates, even primitive liqueurs began appearing in more adventurous taverns. The distillation process wasn't yet common knowledge, but in southern Europe, enterprising alchemists and Arab-influenced scholars were spreading the secrets of turning liquid into something stronger. Early distillates were potent, unpredictable, and extremely flammable, which, come to think of it, also describes many of the patrons who drank them. One favorite oddity was hippocras, a wine infused with sugar and spices, sometimes strained through cloth soaked in milk or egg whites. It was sweet, heady, and oddly luxurious. To sip hippocras was to say, I'm a person of taste. And also, I might fall asleep under this table. What's most fascinating is how normalized all this was. There was no sharp distinction between drinking to feel merry and drinking to feel better. The tavern was a one-stop shop for healing escape and a little gentle disassociation from the fact that your ceiling was made of straw and your landlord had war horses. So next time you picture a medieval tavern, don't just imagine drunken peasants yelling about taxes. Picture a place where candles flicker beside jars of dried herbs, where a mug of something warm might carry you to sleep, or to a bizarre dream about dancing hedgehogs. It was rustic, it was communal, and above all, it was buzzing with possibility. If you thought the peasants were the only ones enjoying a little fermented frivolity, think again. Let's talk about monks, the solemn book-copying, chant-singing spiritual anchors of the medieval world, who were quite frankly often a little tipsy. Monasteries weren't just places of prayer and parchment. they were also some of the most advanced brewing operations in Europe. The monks didn't just brew beer for themselves, of course. They brewed it for pilgrims, for the sick, for guests. And let's be honest, for anyone who wandered in and looked particularly thirsty. In fact, some monastic rules strictly forbade meat, but were oddly quiet about beer. Priorities. Take the Benedictines, for example. Their rule encouraged moderation. Note, moderation, not abstinence. Beer was considered a liquid bread full of nutrients and hydration, perfect for fasting periods when solid food was off the table. And it just so happened to be rather relaxing too. Monks developed recipes that would make modern craft brewers weep with admiration. They experimented with different grains, fermentation techniques, and yes, herbs. Some of these brews were gentle, intended to comfort and soothe. Others were stronger, possibly unintentionally at first, and later, very intentionally. Cistercian monks, not to be outdone, took their brewing to the next level. Their beers were famous for their quality, and the stronger batches were often served to guests and dignitaries. "Welcome, my lord. Bishop, would you like a chalice of holy numbness?" The lines between spiritual duty and recreational inebriation got a little blurry. Monks worked hard. Yes, they tilled gardens, copied manuscripts, and kept daily prayers. But the long hours also gave them reason to seek comfort. And while they might not have called it getting high, the effects of their potions, ales, and herbal tonics would definitely make modern partygoers nod in respect. Beyond beer monasteries were also steeped in the world of herbal remedies. Monks maintained elaborate gardens filled with mint lavender, sorge rue hyssop, and dozens of other plants. These herbs were used in tea salves, ointments, and sometimes wine. And while many concoctions were meant to cure illness, others produced interesting side effects. Take monk's pepper, also known as chasteberry. It was believed to suppress sexual desire. But when taken in the wrong dose or right dose, depending on your goals, it could cause dizziness, a fuzzy-headed feeling, and peculiar dreams. Not exactly divine enlightenment, but definitely something. Even incense wasn't safe. Frankincense and myrrh weren't just symbolic. They also had mild psychoactive properties. In small, repeated doses, say over the course of hours and hours of chanting in a closed stone chapel, the mind would drift. The body might relax. The spirit might feel unshackled. And if nothing else, you'd walk out of the sanctuary with your robes smelling like a bonfire hosted by angels. Now let's consider the monastic wine cellars. Monks didn't simply drink wine, they cultivated it, fermented it, and aged it like true connoisseurs. Some orders had their own vineyards, and the quality of monastic wine was so renowned that even kings sent requests for barrels. Within the cloister, wine was used in sacrament, sure, but also in celebration, in feasts, in moments of contemplation, and in recovery after, say, an overly enthusiastic bout of contemplation. And then there were those rare occasions, festivals, feast days, and saintly anniversaries when the monks cut loose. These weren't wild raves, but they weren't entirely sober affairs either. Stronger brews made appearances. Stories were told. Hymns turned a little rowdier. It wasn't so much partying as it was spiritually enhanced unwinding. In some places, the clergy's drinking habits caused concern. Church authorities issued the occasional grumble about monks indulging too freely in the fruit of the vine or becoming worldly in their tastes. But unless things got wildly out of hand, say Brother Ambrose attempting to baptize a goose, most of these indulgences were quietly tolerated. After all, the monks were also the ones brewing the communion wine. And while they weren't purposefully seeking hallucinations, certain combinations of herbs and rituals could absolutely send someone into altered states of consciousness. Fasting, sleeplessness, and repetitive chanting already created a fertile mental state. Add a strong herbal elixir or a too generous splash of spiced wine, and suddenly your evening prayer session turns into a deeply personal conversation with a glowing fish that quotes scripture. What's particularly fascinating is that these experiences were not seen as drug trips in the modern sense. Visions, dreams, and mental journeys were interpreted as signs of divine communication, spiritual clarity, or intense piety. No one asked whether it was the Holy Spirit or the wormwood. It was both, probably. And who are we to question the methods? This mindset carried over into monastery medicine as well. Painkillers made from poppy sedatives, brewed from valerian root, and tonics laced with bitter herbs were dispensed with genuine care. And sometimes, in a moment of empathy, a monk might pour himself a thimbleful too, just to test the dosage. So while the image of the pious sober monk remained strong in popular imagination, the reality was more nuanced. These were men of the cloth and the cask. They were both spiritual guides and experimental brewers. They sang psalms and stirred pots. And when the day's work was done, they sat beneath candlelight with a mug of something ancient, warm, and gently mind-altering, meditating perhaps on the mysteries of the universe. Or maybe just watching the walls breathe. Let's leave the cloisters behind now and head straight into the fields, where the sun beats down on bent backs. The air smells of manure, and the average peasant has just discovered that the berry they picked for lunch is making the ground wiggle. Welcome to the world of low-budget highs, the rural peasant edition. You see, getting high wasn't reserved for monks, nobles, or traveling alchemists. Peasants, resourceful, curious, and occasionally desperate, also found ways to escape the daily grind, often through methods that were, let's say, experimental at best, and you might die at worst. Take mushrooms. Not the button variety you toss in a stew. We're talking Amanita muscaraya, the red and white spotted toadstool that looks like it belongs in a fairy tale and behaves like it belongs in a hallucination. These mushrooms grow in the wild across Europe and have a long, strange history of use. When dried, they lose some of their more toxic compounds and become well interesting. In small amounts, they could induce dreamlike states, visual distortions, and a profound desire to lie down and giggle at thatched roofs. The catch: the difference between a safe dose and a deeply regrettable one was about the size of a goose feather. Many who tried these mushrooms didn't exactly come back with poetic insight. They came back with vomiting tremors or a passionate commitment to never eat spotted bread lumps again. Still, stories persisted of wise women, village herbalists, and wandering mystics who knew how to dry and prepare these mushrooms for ceremonial use. In Slavic regions and parts of Scandinavia, it's believed such fungi had ritual uses even before Christianity took hold. And in more remote, superstitious pockets of medieval Europe, a peasant's brush with intoxication could easily be reinterpreted as a brush with the spirit world. But mushrooms weren't the only back alley into altered consciousness. Henbane was another wild and wicked friend. This nightshade family plant was notorious for inducing dizziness visions and sensations of flying, or as some scholars suggest, the sensation of watching yourself. Think about flying. Charming. It was often used in salves or potions, though anyone who took too much risked convulsions or slipping into a catatonic daze that felt less buzzed and more being stored like a broom. And let's not forget datura, sometimes called devil's trumpet, with large trumpet-shaped flowers and a habit of showing up in places people probably shouldn't forage. Datura was beautiful, powerful, and deeply hallucinogenic. It also had the unfortunate tendency to erase memory, so peasants who used it might experience something dramatic and then spend 3 days asking why their boots were full of river eels. Berries, too, made mischief. Elderberries were fine, once cooked but raw, mildly toxic, and known for inspiring what some historians have generously described as a sense of altered reality. Nightshade berries, dark, glossy, and appealing to the uninformed, were more sinister. They could cause blurred vision delirium and heart palpitations. Still, people tried them, and occasionally someone swore they saw fairies. Now it's worth remembering that medieval peasants didn't have TikTok or Wikipedia. They learned by rumor repetition and trial and error, emphasis on the error. One villager might swear that a particular route brought calming dreams. Another might insist it turned her uncle into a frog. A third might try it and simply disappear into the woods for 2 days before returning with a beard full of bees and no explanation. Despite the dangers, these plants and herbs were often used with intention. Rural folk used them for pain relief, spiritual insight, or simply a moment's reprieve from the grinding demands of survival. If you'd spent your life hoeing fields, burying cousins, and hoping not to die from damp socks, you too might chew a questionable flower on a dare. Some traditions even developed around this. In certain regions, seasonal rituals involved herbal mixtures meant to connect with ancestors or spirits. A community might gather at midsummer drink, a brew laced with mugwort or wild poppy, and dance around a fire until someone decided the moon was telling jokes. Local healers often had their own recipes passed down, guarded and modified with whatever grew nearby. These weren't scientific formulations. They were crafted from memory, gut instinct, and a slightly alarming level of improvisation. A little of this root, a pinch of that flower, and maybe a whisper to the wind just in case. And then, of course, there was alcohol. Peasants made their own rudimentary meads and ales, sometimes infusing them with herbs or berries for extra kick. Wild fermentation often resulted in unpredictable results. One batch made you sleepy, the next made you extremely chatty, and the third convinced you that your sheep were plotting a revolt. The social side of this can't be overstated. Sharing these concoctions wasn't just about the effects, it was about bonding. Sitting around a fire, passing a flask, and listening to stories about that one guy who tried too much foxglove and started barking at trees was as much community building as it was recreation. There were even tales of travelers bringing strange seeds or powders from distant lands, gifts from gypsies, soldiers, or lost pilgrims. Did they actually work sometimes? Were they secretly just dried beet shavings? Probably, but the mystery was part of the charm. Ultimately, For medieval peasants, getting high was less about indulgence and more about improvisation. They worked with what they had: wild plants, fermented liquids, and a resilient sense of curiosity. And if occasionally a well intentioned snack led to someone believing they were married to a cloud, well, at least they had a story to tell at the next festival. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine a crooked cottage on a foggy hill where someone is carefully stirring a pot of herbal brew over a crackling fire. Outside, the sheep are suspiciously quiet. Inside, the laughter is warm. The walls seem to lean a little, and reality feels just soft enough to let the stars twinkle a bit closer. Now that we've sampled the peasant pantry of psychedelic produce, let's turn our gaze to one of the more potent and quietly controversial intoxicants of the medieval world: opium. You might be surprised to learn just how often it shows up, not in dens of debauchery, but in pharmacies, monasteries, and even on battlefield surgery tables. Opium wasn't taboo. It was medicine, and it worked, sometimes too well. Let's begin with a little context. Opium is derived from the poppy plant, specifically Papaver somniferum, which the Greeks had been using for centuries before medieval Europe ever gave it a second sniff. The dried latex extracted from its pods could be eaten drunk or turned into a paste. And in small amounts, it dulled pain, soothed coughs, quieted nerves, and in a world where almost everything hurt, it quickly became a staple of the medieval toolkit. It was called by many names: opium meconium, or simply poppy juice. Apothecaries would grind it, steep it in wine, or blend it into pastes. Physicians wrote about it with cautious reverence. Used wisely, it was a godsend. Used unwisely, well, let's just say you might fall asleep on a Thursday and wake up in the next century. One of the most common forms was laudanum, a tincture of opium in alcohol. Though the term wouldn't take hold until the Renaissance, earlier prototypes existed in the form of wine steeped with poppy seeds. Doctors and monks alike prescribed it for toothaches, broken limbs, melancholy, insomnia, and everything in between. Your neighbor's cow stepped on your foot, laudanum. Your neighbor was a cow, and you were the only one who saw it, still laudanum. And where was this all happening? Not in some dusty corner of the apothecary's shop. This was front and center medicine. In monasteries especially, opium mixtures were routinely stored in locked cabinets, administered by those trusted with the care of the sick. These weren't shady dealings. They were acts of mercy. But here's the thing about opium: it feels like mercy. It slips over the mind like warm velvet, eases pain with a lazy hush, and replaces your troubles with slow blooming nothingness. In a time before anesthetics, before real mental health care, before indoor plumbing or soap that didn't smell like sheep. That kind of relief was more than tempting. It was sacred. In fact, many monasteries and hospitals developed their own proprietary opium blends. Some were mixed with honey. Others were added to syrup of violets or spiced wine. The exact recipes varied, and so did the effects. A mild dose might make a feverish child sleep through the night. A heavy dose might help a wounded knight forget the arrow in his leg and possibly forget everything else, including how to blink. You might be wondering, did people realize opium was addictive? Not in the way we do now. They knew it was powerful. They knew it should be used carefully. But the concept of addiction as a chemical dependency hadn't yet taken hold. Instead, chronic users were seen as weakened by poppy or lost in the dream. It had a poetic air, which probably didn't help discourage it. Still, stories began to circulate tales of noblemen who could no longer sleep without their tinctures, monks who seemed more dazed than devout, and patients who stopped requesting food but always remembered to ask for their syrup. There were even reports of wandering mendicants who carried little bottles of the stuff, offering it to the sick and occasionally to the bored in exchange for coins, bread, or secrets. In the Islamic world, which had a more advanced medical tradition at the time, opium was used with surgical precision. Knowledge of distillation dosage and herbal pairing was much more refined, and some of that knowledge slowly filtered into Europe through contact in Spain, Sicily, and the Crusades. European physicians borrowed heavily from Arab medical texts, which meant that opium's popularity only grew. Interestingly, it wasn't just used for pain. Opium was also considered a sleep aid, an anti-anxiety potion, and even, ironically, a way to treat digestive trouble. The same substance that made you dream of floating above a field of talking onions was also prescribed for excessive wind. There were spiritual dimensions to its use as well. Mystics and ascetics sometimes reported profound visions during or after poppy-laced sleep. Whether these visions were divine or drug-induced was a matter of interpretation. After all, if you're a monk who dreams of a talking lion, who gives you advice about your personal failings, do you question it, or do you thank God and take better care of your sandals? One of the most haunting realities, though, is how opium was used in end-of-life care. Terminally ill patients were often given increasingly strong doses until pain was no longer a concern, and consciousness eventually wasn't either. This wasn't seen as dark or controversial. It was a kindness, an easing, a soft veil drawn over the eyes of someone whose world had become sharp and cruel. There were, of course, problems. Overdoses happened. Mislabeling was a risk. And in a world without precise scales or standardized measuring spoons, just a little could turn into oops, he's not blinking anymore. Still, the benefits were too profound to ignore, and so poppy fields quietly thrived in monastery gardens. Apothecaries stocked seed pods and labeled them in careful Latin. Physicians carried pouches of dried resin and wrote long flowing prescriptions in looped script. And somewhere in a quiet cottage, a woman stirred a pot of sweet wine, dropped in a pinch of something dark and sticky, and whispered a prayer for dreamless sleep. As you drift deeper, now imagine lying in a cool stone room, candlelight flickering on a low ceiling, with a linen-wrapped bundle under your head, and the faint smell of lavender and poppy in the air. Outside, a monk hums softly in the courtyard. Inside, your pain is gone, your limbs are light, and the world slips slowly out of focus, like the last glow of twilight over the cloister wall. Let's now open the creaky wooden pantry of the medieval household and take a peek inside. Next to the onions and the regrettably aggressive cheese, you'll find what can only be described as a surprisingly well-stocked narcotics cabinet, if of course you know what you're looking for. Because some of the most potent medieval intoxicants weren't exotic imports or pharmacist-only secrets. They were just sitting in your kitchen, right next to the soup pot. Welcome to the spicy, leafy, and absolutely untrustworthy world of witches' herbs and culinary hallucinations. First, Let's talk about mandrake. This infamous root was basically the medieval equivalent of a celebrity scandal, half truth, half hysteria, and deeply rooted in folklore. Its gnarled, vaguely human shape terrified and fascinated people. Digging one up was said to trigger a blood-curdling scream, capable of killing a man instantly, unless, of course, you cleverly tied it to a dog and let it do the digging. Medieval people, imaginative, slightly unkind to dogs, and 100% committed to drama. Mandrake was believed to possess magical properties and was used in various salves and potions. It could ease pain, induce sleep, or in larger doses, send you flying through hallucinations of fiery chariots, talking statues, and unsettlingly cheerful clouds. Herbalists knew that even a pinch could knock someone into dreamland, and a bit more could turn them into a full-blown mystic or a garden statue. Another superstar of medieval tripping was belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade. Beautiful plant, gorgeous berries, mildly homicidal. Women sometimes use small amounts of belladonna extract to dilate their pupils, which was considered alluring, hence the name belladonna, or beautiful lady. Less attractively, those same berries were highly toxic and could bring on delirium, blurred vision, and a sudden belief that your neighbor's goat was speaking Latin. But belladonna had its place. In tiny, carefully administered doses, it was sometimes used in flying ointments, salves applied to the skin that supposedly allowed witches to fly. And by fly, we mean hallucinate intensely while lying in bed covered in goose fat. The ointment was rubbed into warm areas like armpits, groins, and in some accounts, broom handles, which has led to some truly imaginative interpretations of what flying on a broomstick might actually have entailed. Then there was nutmeg. Yes, the same spice you might grate over an eggnog today was once a pathway to medieval mind melting. Consumed in large quantities, say a few teaspoons, it could cause dizziness, a sense of floating hallucinations, and hours of what one 16th century account described as dreamful waking. Of course, it could also cause nausea, dehydration, and a strong desire to never touch a spice rack again. But still, who knew your pantry held such power? And don't forget mugwort. This plant, humble in appearance and smell, was used to encourage vivid dreams and even prophetic visions. It was brewed into teas, tucked under pillows, or burned as incense. Mugwort doesn't have the same walloping effect as something like henbane, but its influence was subtler, helping to blur the line between sleep and wakefulness, between what was real and what was maybe just the cat sitting on your chest, whispering medieval Latin again. Witchcraft texts and folk recipes often combined several of these ingredients into potions or brews that promised love, courage, invisibility, or insight. Did they deliver? Sometimes. More often, they delivered mild poisoning and a sudden need to lie down and question your choices. Many such mixtures were rooted in real pharmacological effects. For example, combining belladonna with mandrake and a little alcohol created a trifecta of muscle relaxation, confusion, and hallucinations. It's not hard to see why some villagers believed they were seeing spirits or slipping between worlds. Their brains were quite literally taking a detour through the shadowy woods of chemistry. Now, we can't talk about medieval kitchen highs without mentioning thyme sage and rosemary, the holy trinity of this smells good, but might also rearrange your thoughts. While not hallucinogenic in the traditional sense, In large quantities, or when combined with fermented wine or oils, these herbs were believed to clear the mind, lift the spirit, and induce calm. Essentially, the aromatherapy aisle of the medieval general store, but with a risk of excessive enlightenment if overdone. And then there's tansy. Oh, tansy, a sweet-smelling bitter herb used in spring cakes, medicinal brews, and questionable digestive tonics. In small doses, it might help with cramps. In larger ones, it might help you leave your body and watch your goat soul hover over the village square. Tansy was often folded into feasts during Lent and Easter, not just for flavor, but for its supposed purifying effects. Purifying what exactly was up for debate. Interestingly, many of these plants were part of normal everyday recipes. The line between dinner and spiritual experience was often shockingly thin. A calming stew might involve mugwort and sage with a hint of poppy seed. A warming wine might feature clove nutmeg and just enough nightshade to make your dreams hum. There were no labels, no disclaimers. Only old knowledge, careful hands, and the occasional catastrophic dinner party. Women, particularly midwives and herbalists, were the keepers of this knowledge. They knew how to dose, how to prepare, and when not to serve a certain tea. These women were valued, feared, and often accused of witchcraft when the local bailiff saw a purple rabbit on his way to confession. Their kitchens were part apothecary, part mystic sanctuary, part chemical testing ground. Even so, most people didn't approach these herbs casually. They were respected, even feared, and rightly so. The wrong combination could bring on tremors, paralysis, or death. But when used carefully, they allowed ordinary people, especially women, the poor, and the desperate, a way to control their experience, if only for a night. So as you drift into your own sleep, tonight, picture a humble hearth fire crackling in a dim stone kitchen. A pot hangs above the flames, bubbling with herbs, wine, and a touch of something mysterious. The air is rich with spice and smoke. A woman stirs gently, not speaking, while outside the wind murmurs through the trees. Perhaps the night will bring dreams, perhaps something more. Now that we've poked around in the medieval pantry and stirred a few herbal brews, let's take a closer look at how people actually consumed these intoxicants. Because in the Middle Ages, getting high wasn't just about what you took, it was about how you took it. And trust me, they got inventive. Let's start with sniffing. That's right, people in medieval Europe were snorting powders long before anyone thought to label it a modern problem. Certain herbs and resins, when dried and crushed, were inhaled for their pungent effects. Peppermint, lavender, and even dried sage were sometimes ground and sniffed to clear the mind or sharpen memory. But then, things got bolder. Substances like cinnamon or clove powder, when inhaled, caused a burning sensation in the nose, followed by what one might generously call alertness, and less generously frantic sneezing hallucinations. Still, for people hoping to feel energized without resorting to a full-on potion, this was one way to go. And if it also made you sneeze 17 times and think the cat was judging you, well, small price to pay. Then there was chewing, the medieval equivalent of popping a mint, except the mint might also induce trance states or cause your legs to forget how stairs work. Roots like valerian angelica and licorice were chewed not just for flavor or breath freshening, but for their relaxing, sometimes mildly psychoactive effects. Chew a little too long, though, and suddenly you're staring at your sheep and wondering why they're holding a grudge. Petoni, a flowering plant praised by both herbalists and drunk uncles, was said to cure headaches, keep away ghosts, and restore the mind. Chewing it was popular among travelers and pilgrims who often needed something to keep their spirits up and their thoughts slightly sideways. But perhaps the most fascinating method was rubbing. Yes, topical application of herbal salves and ointments. These weren't your modern menthol rubs, though. Many medieval ointments were made with herbs like henbane, mandrake belladonna, and poppy ingredients with serious neurological punch. These were mixed into animal fat or oils and applied to the skin, often in warm, absorbent areas. Some used it for pain relief. Others used it for, let's say, recreational purposes. In the folklore of the period, witches' flying ointments were allegedly applied to the skin or broomsticks to induce hallucinations of flight. Whether these were actual airborne experiences or just intense trips in front of the fireplace is debatable, but the effects were vivid. Accounts describe visions of forests blooming upside down, of animals speaking of the moon, winking suggestively. Not your average Tuesday, the rubbing method had some advantages. It bypassed the stomach, making it safer for those with weak constitutions or who didn't want to vomit on the town priest again. It was also more discreet. A salve could be applied in private with no need for suspicious teas or mysterious powders. Just a bit of ointment, a quiet room, and some time to float. There were also steam inhalations, often used in both healing and, shall we say, atmospheric enhancement. Imagine a small hut filled with burning herbs, mugwort, thyme, fennel, and thick aromatic steam. Whether it was for clearing sinuses or opening the inner eye was often left delightfully unclear. Sit in that steam long enough, and your thoughts might begin to meander, followed by your sense of direction. Some pilgrims, particularly in Eastern or Southern Europe, used incense and smoke for ritualistic intoxication. Frankincense, myrrh, and occasionally more potent resins like styrax or labdanum were burned in small spaces. The smoke was believed to cleanse, purify, and sometimes, if you breathed enough of it, transport you to a spiritual plane where birds recited scripture and your regrets melted into rose-scented vapor. And let's not forget infused wine and ale, the all-purpose delivery system. Nearly any herb or resin could be steeped in alcohol. Medieval brewers weren't picky. If it could be boiled, stirred, or sprinkled in, it probably was. An ale spiked with rosemary and sage might lift your mood. A wine infused with poppy and clove might knock you out cold. People developed favorites. Some swore by a certain green tonic from a particular tavern. Others preferred a claret with a touch of vision. Names weren't listed. You just knew. But of course, not every method was clever. Sometimes people simply ate the wrong thing. A mushroom on the forest floor, a bitter-tasting leaf, a mysterious root passed down by a cousin's cousin who once met a Roman soldier in a dream. Ingesting the unknown was part of life and occasionally part of death. But that risk didn't always stop people. Because when you spend your days hauling mud, dodging disease, and getting yelled at by a guy who thinks soup is witchcraft, you might be willing to take a gamble on a funny-looking berry. And yes, there were combinations. The bold or the very bored mixed methods. A little wine, a rubbed salve, a sniff of powder. Layering effects became something of an art, especially among the mystically inclined. You could drink a sedating tea, rub a bit of flying ointment on your chest, and then lie on a bed of mugwort while chanting psalms backwards. Did it work? Probably not how they expected, but did it make the stars spin politely? Possibly. All of this paints a picture of a world where the body and the senses were not just accepted as vessels of experience, they were treated as instruments to be played, nudged, tuned, and occasionally, very badly, overblown. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavier, imagine a small wooden house lit only by a candle stub. A woman chews a root by the fire. A man rubs a strange-smelling ointment on his temples. Outside, smoke drifts from a chimney carrying scents of rosemary and pine. Inside, reality begins to bend just slightly, and the line between waking and dreaming begins to ripple like heat off a midsummer road. Let's leave behind the common folk and their backyard experiments and turn our attention to the most unexpected party guests at the medieval intoxication banquet, the clergy. That's right, the very people responsible for your moral salvation were sometimes just a bit spiritually elevated. Not intentionally, perhaps, but incense and herbal remedies had a way of sneaking up on even the most pious bishop. Let's start with the basics: incense. In churches and cathedrals across medieval Europe, burning incense was part of almost every major religious service. The air inside these spaces, thick with the smoke of frankincense, myrrh, copal, and styrax, was meant to elevate the soul and symbolize prayers rising to heaven. But incense isn't just fragrant, it's mildly psychoactive. When burned in large quantities in enclosed spaces over long periods, the effect could be surprisingly relaxing. Picture a poorly ventilated chapel with stained glass, filtering soft blue light, dozens of candles flickering in the haze, and a heavy golden censer swinging rhythmically down the aisle. Now add in hours of chanting, fasting, and kneeling on cold stone. Your senses blur. Time begins to stretch. The line between sacred vision and slight disorientation starts to smudge. For clergy who lived in this environment day after day, the state of mild euphoria or lightheadedness wasn't just expected, it was built in, especially during high feasts, vigils, and ordination ceremonies. The amount of incense used could border on absurd. One chronicler from the 13th century wryly noted that the Easter Vigil Mass left him so full of heavenly fragrance, I forgot entirely the sound of my own voice. And the incense wasn't the only culprit. Many religious orders, particularly monks and abbots, used wine and herbal elixirs in their daily routines. A Benedictine prior might sip a wine steeped with valerian root before evening prayer to calm his nerves. A nun suffering from sleeplessness might be given a mixture of chamomile poppy and rose water, with instructions to pray and not look at the stars too long. Sometimes the effects were subtle. A warm, floaty sensation during Vespers, a gentle swaying during Matins. Other times, especially when the recipe was a little off, or the dosage too enthusiastic, the results were more theatrical. Slurred Latin, mistaken hymns, or spontaneous revelations about the true nature of fish. There are recorded instances of abbots who insisted they saw angels mid-sermon, only to later confess they'd sampled a new clover cordial the night before. The use of herbal remedies among clergy was not only widespread, but respected. These weren't secret vices. They were part of religious medicine. Monasteries were often the centers of medical knowledge in medieval Europe, and monks took their herbal work seriously. That meant cultivating gardens filled with mandrake hellebore, wild lettuce, wormwood, and dozens of other potent plants. Wormwood, for example, famous later as the key ingredient in absinthe, was regularly used in monastic digestive tonics. But in strong doses, wormwood could cause hallucinations and convulsions. Yet its reputation as a holy purifier led to generous applications. If a monk started speaking in tongues, was it divine inspiration or an oversteeped tummy tea? Who could say? We also have reports of clergy using flying ointments, although the documentation is vague, perhaps intentionally so. In some monastic texts, there are euphemistic references to ointment rituals for meditative vision or unguents for lifting prayer. These are often paired with warnings about dosage or notes about strong dreams and unusual clarity of sensation. Subtle, yes, but not exactly accidental. And then there's the papacy. Yes, even the popes weren't entirely immune to the cloud of curious substances drifting through Christendom. While most popes maintained strict ceremonial control, some were known to indulge in the more luxurious side of ecclesiastical life. Spiced wines, rare incense, and imported Eastern tonics made their way to the papal palace in Avignon or Rome, often as diplomatic gifts. One 14th century account describes Pope John XIII hosting a feast where the wine had been aromatized with musk nutmeg and certain foreign resins that made the head feel like a ringing bell. Whether he meant it literally or metaphorically is unclear, but given the state of medicine at the time, either interpretation seems valid. Another story, almost certainly exaggerated, but popular among chroniclers, claims that a bishop once became so intoxicated by incense during Easter services that he began to levitate. More likely, he tripped over his robe and fell into a choir boy. But the idea stuck. After all, who doesn't want a little supernatural PR? The interesting thing is that none of this was necessarily seen as sinful. Altered states brought on by sacred scents, solemn rituals, or holy drinks were often interpreted as spiritual experiences. Visions, ecstasies, and profound stillness were welcomed, even sought after. The idea that spiritual clarity could be supported or at least coaxed by the physical world wasn't strange. It was embraced. But that doesn't mean people didn't notice when things got a little too elevated. Monastic rules often included warnings about overuse of certain herbs or tonics. Priests were occasionally reprimanded for slowness of speech during Mass. And yes, there were whispered jokes in cathedral corridors about which abbots prayed the longest and poured the deepest. Still, the relationship between intoxication and spirituality remained tangled, complex, and oddly beautiful. Whether by smoke, by sip, or by salve, the clergy's encounters with altered states weren't just tolerated, they were woven into the texture of belief. So as you settle deeper into the quiet of your own sanctuary tonight, picture a dimly lit chapel, the scent of incense curling through the air. A monk bows low, candlelight flickering in his eyes. His lips move in silent prayer, but his thoughts drift through dreams, through fragrance, through the velvet hush of a world just slightly out of focus. Let's raise our goblets now to the upper crust of medieval society, the nobles. While peasants were experimenting with mushrooms and hedge-plucked herbs, and monks were accidentally drifting off during vespers, the lords and ladies of the castle were getting high in ways that were, let's say, luxuriously inconvenient. Because if you were rich in the Middle Ages, intoxication wasn't just about escaping reality, it was about doing it elegantly. Let's start with spiced wine, which for nobles wasn't just a drink, it was an event. Known as claret hippocras or mulled wine, these concoctions were usually made with imported spices, cinnamon, ginger cloves, nutmeg, even black pepper. All of these were rare, expensive, and difficult to transport, which made the resulting drink an unmistakable status symbol. You weren't just sipping wine, you were sipping the Silk Road. But here's the twist. Those spices didn't just taste good. In high quantities, some, especially nutmeg, had mild psychoactive properties. A heavily spiced hippocras might make you feel warm, chatty, a little floaty, and eventually extremely fond of your loot collection. This wasn't accidental. Some court recipes for wine were carefully engineered to deliver a slow, pleasant unraveling of tension. Add a few crushed poppy seeds, maybe a splash of wormwood extract, stir in some rose water or musk syrup, and suddenly you're seeing halos around the chandelier, or the torch sconce, or your cousin. And nobles didn't stop at wine. Perfume smoke became increasingly fashionable, particularly in southern Europe. Charcoal braziers would be placed throughout noble households, filled with exotic resins like frankincense benzoin or labdanum, then lit to perfume the air and lift the mood. Guests at court might wander through chambers, thick with sweet-smelling haze, sipping cordial, and making small talk about falconry, while gently swaying to invisible music. These weren't just nice smells. Some resins had subtle psychoactive effects when burned in large quantities. Benzoin, for instance, contains compounds that can affect mood and cognition. Labdanum, a musky resin harvested from the rock rose shrub, was prized for its intense aroma and soothing properties. Inhaling these over hours of feasting and conversation could induce an almost meditative state, or at least make you nod sagely while forgetting the point of the story you were telling. Meanwhile, over in the kitchens, alchemists and court physicians were hard at work concocting elixirs and cordials. These were sweetened infusions of herbs, often alcohol-based and supposedly restorative. For the nerves, for melancholy, for gout, but also for boredom. Because nothing breaks up a tedious diplomatic dinner like a few drops of a mystery tincture slipped into your goblet. Some were harmless syrup of violets, rose water with honey. Others, not so much. A cordial laced with valerian and wild lettuce might leave a baron peacefully dreaming through the second course, which was ideal if the main dish was another argument about land taxes. Then there's the imported stuff. By the late Middle Ages, trade with the East was beginning to bring new and exciting substances to European courts, among them hashish. That's right. Though rare and not widely documented, there are hints that hashish or cannabis resin made its way into noble hands via Muslim Spain Venetian merchants or travelers returning from crusades. It wasn't smoked, typically it was eaten, mixed into sweets or pastes, occasionally offered at feasts as a kind of novelty or exotic treat. Try this, my lord. It's from Damascus. May cause visions of dancing camels. Accounts are sparse, partly because no one wanted to admit that the Duke of Burgundy spent 3 hours explaining his armor to a candlestick. And then we have alchemical tonics, the pre-modern answer to, I don't know what this is, but I'm going to drink it anyway. Nobles had a fascination with alchemists, those enigmatic figures promising eternal life gold, or at the very least, excellent skin. Many alchemists dabbled in spagyrics, the blending of herbal substances into concentrated forms meant to purify both body and soul. Some of these included powerful herbs like mandrake opium or henbane, distilled and clarified through glass tubes, and elaborate rituals that mostly ended in mysterious purple smoke and vague apologies. It was fashionable at court to toy with the idea of transcendence. Nobles weren't just seeking physical pleasure, they were aiming for enlightenment, clarity, revelation, at least when they weren't busy jousting or arguing over cheese tariffs. Intoxication, especially the controlled, luxurious kind, was seen as part of that journey. A lord might lock himself away for days, fasting, sipping herbal wine, inhaling special smoke, and waiting for the cosmos to reveal itself. Or just to forget about that unfortunate business with the jester and the duck. Noblewomen, too, had their own mixtures, beauty elixirs with opiate undertones, sleep potions, or incense baths designed to cleanse the spirit. Whether it worked was irrelevant. It felt important. And in a world where the only other form of escape was embroidery, you took what you could get. Let's not forget that these indulgences were almost always ritualized. There was a rhythm to it. Drink this burn, that chew, here lie back. Listen to the lute. It was structured, expected, and in some ways communal. Getting high wasn't necessarily about isolation. It was about shared experience. Like a mini vacation without the hassle of actual travel. So tonight, as your thoughts drift, like resin smoke in a stone hall, picture a long banquet table lit by flickering torches. A nobleman lifts a golden goblet, its rim sticky with honeyed wine. Music plays softly in the background. A lady laughs gently, tipping her head back, the scent of clove and cinnamon curling through her curls. And somewhere behind a curtain, the court physician mixes something new, something fragrant, mysterious, and just strong enough to make the stars look slightly closer than they were before. Now let's take a break from velvet-draped halls and perfumed banquets and hit the road, literally. Picture a dusty footpath, a weathered satchel, and blistered feet heading towards salvation. That's right, we're walking with pilgrims. You might think these devout travelers kept their minds clear and focused on holy destinations like Rome, Santiago de Compostela, or Canterbury. But medieval pilgrimages were long, exhausting, and full of surprises. Some of those surprises came in the form of psychedelic experiences, whether intentional or... Oops, someone put that in the stew again. First, consider the physical toll. Pilgrimages were grueling. We're talking hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles on foot. No painkillers, no arch supports, just you, your sandals, and the hope that the saint you're walking toward appreciates sore knees and spiritual dehydration. Naturally, travelers turned to whatever remedies they could find along the way. And along those winding routes were a lot of herbalists, monks, innkeepers, and enterprising roadside vendors more than happy to offer a little relief. Let's start with herbal tonics, which were especially popular in monastic hospitals and way stations. Pilgrims suffering from fatigue headaches or spiritual confusion, aka emotional meltdown, might be given a drink of wine steeped with poppy wormwood or angelica root. These weren't necessarily offered as recreational highs, but the effects often strayed well past refreshed. Imagine trudging through the Alps for 3 days, stopping for shelter, and being handed a steaming cup of monk-brewed wine that makes the sky hum, and your feet forget they exist. In fact, some pilgrims described profound spiritual experiences after drinking these concoctions. Visions of saints, vivid dreams, a deep sense of connection to the divine, or at least to the goose sleeping on their face. These moments were often interpreted not as side effects, but as blessings. After all, if you saw a glowing Virgin Mary at sunrise after a draught of herbal syrup, it clearly meant your prayers were working. And not that Brother Hubert went a little heavy on the mugwort. Certain routes were particularly notorious for their mind-altering offerings. In southern France and northern Spain, local healers and religious houses often used mugwort valerian and even mild doses of henbane in teas and ointments meant to soothe the aches of the faithful. But when combined with long fasting dehydration and hours of chanting, these soothing brews could lead to intense visions. You might believe your walking staff was giving you advice. You might hear the stones on the road singing psalms. You might wake up with your face in a candle and feel totally okay with it. And then there was mystical bread. Yes, bread. Pilgrims were often fed communal loaves at shrines and hospices, sometimes baked with herbs meant to promote healing and divine insight. Occasionally, these herbs included ergot-contaminated rye, unintentionally, of course. Ergot is a fungus that grows on cereal grains, and when consumed can cause a condition known as St. Anthony's fire. Symptoms include burning sensations, convulsions, hallucinations, and the feeling that your limbs are not where you left them. Not a great souvenir, but very popular in poorly ventilated monasteries. For some pilgrims, these episodes became moments of ecstatic religious transformation. Visions of angels' fire, radiant lights, and disembodied voices were all interpreted as divine encounters, even if the actual cause was a piece of tainted barley bread. The line between holy and hallucinogenic was as ever porous. Even music and ritual played a part in these altered experiences. Along the road, pilgrims often joined night vigils or processions with chanting, drumming, and incense. The repetitive rhythm, combined with sleep deprivation and ambient herbal smoke, could bring on trance-like states. Picture walking for hours, humming the same prayer, surrounded by flickering torches and the distant hum of bells. Add in a cup of fortified wine, and your soul might very well start levitating without your permission. And let's not forget visionary relics. Pilgrims who reached major destinations like Mont Saint-Michel or the Shrine of St. James often underwent emotionally intense rituals, touching bones, kissing reliquaries, crawling through sacred tunnels. If you were lucky, someone would hand you a relic-infused amulet dipped in rosewater and purified with sacred herbs. If you were really lucky, the sacred herbs included mild opiates, and you spent the next 2 days staring at clouds that resembled the apostles. Interestingly, pilgrimage intoxication wasn't always personal. It was communal. Travelers formed bonds as they shared food, drink, and dreams. Someone would recount a vision they had in the night, and the others would nod in awe. Never mind that it was clearly just a nutmeg overdose mixed with emotional exhaustion. The collective belief that these experiences were meaningful gave them power. High or not, you were part of something. Of course, not all pilgrim highs were mystical. Some were just unfortunate. Bad berries, rotten wine, unfamiliar herbs, and generous innkeepers could turn an already difficult journey into a kaleidoscope of regret. But even then, the line between spiritual trial and herbal accident was blurry. After all, if your legs gave out and you woke up seeing halos, maybe that was just God's way of telling you to rest. By the time pilgrims returned home, thinner, holier, and possibly still lightly vibrating, they brought stories of not only the relics they saw and the blessings they earned, but also the moments. The strange glowing moments when reality shifted, the world softened, and something else, something beyond, peeked through. So as you nestle deeper into your blankets tonight, imagine a tired traveler leaning on a staff, watching the stars blur overhead. Around a small fire, others sip from a steaming cup passed from hand to hand. The night air hums with distant bells. Eyes close, breaths slow. And for a while, the long road disappears into warm, dark quiet. Now let's dim the torchlight and step into one of the darkest chapters of medieval life, the plague years. The Black Death was more than a catastrophe. It was an apocalypse wrapped in a fever dream. But tonight, we're not diving into the horror. We're following the trail of how people coped and what they reached for when everything, including their neighbors, started collapsing. Spoiler, it wasn't just prayer. It was also Poppy's potions and whatever got you through the night. First, remember that the plague wasn't a weekend problem. It came in waves, waves that stretched over decades. Fear became a permanent fixture in daily life, and death wasn't some abstract, philosophical idea. It was coughing in the next room, spreading through the town square and scratching at your door. And in the face of that creeping dread, people turned again and again to whatever brought even the illusion of relief. Enter opium stage left. We've already met the medieval poppy, but during plague outbreaks, its use skyrocketed. Physicians and apothecaries leaned heavily on poppy-based remedies to treat the suffering, or at least to dull their awareness of it. Recipes for syrup of poppies, electuaries, herbal pastes, and infused wines were copied and recopied in plague manuals, sometimes mixed with honey vinegar or rose water. These concoctions were administered to calm panic, soothe fever dreams, or simply knock people out long enough to forget that the street outside was full of smoke and cartwheels and bell ringers chanting, "Bring out your dead." Monasteries and hospitals began stockpiling poppy and mandrake, sometimes creating a type of proto-anesthesia. For patients too sick to eat or drink, opiate pastes were rubbed onto the gums or mixed into warm broth. Whether or not these helped is debatable, but when the other option was screaming and bleeding into a linen sheet, the bar for success was low. But opium wasn't the only tool in the chest. Valerian root was heavily used for anxiety and sleep, while henbane and wild lettuce were brewed into teas for pain and sedation. Some enterprising physicians combined several into what were essentially medieval nightcaps, sludgy, bitter brews that could make you forget your name, your location, and the fact that your barber was now your surgeon. There's even evidence that some plague doctors, those infamous bird-masked figures, used mild intoxicants themselves while treating patients. It makes sense. The mask's beak wasn't just for dramatic flair. It was stuffed with aromatic herbs and resins, lavender, mint, rosemary, and myrrh to purify the air. But breathing through a beak stuffed with burning resin and crushed valerian for hours might have had some unanticipated effects. Some reported lightheadedness. Others saw angels. Doctors, monks, midwives. Many of them started using calming aids to get through their impossible workload. Imagine stitching up buboes by candlelight, your face burning behind a leather mask as bells toll and the incense swirls around you. Would you not sneak a sip of that poppy wine? Exactly. Then there were the folk remedies passed from house to house, whispered between mothers and daughters. Some were practical garlic vinegar or onions. Others were strange and speculative. One popular tonic involved clove wormwood and burnt feathers, which, if nothing else, distracted you from your symptoms by setting your taste buds on fire. In Italy and southern France, more adventurous recipes included wine infused with nutmeg, saffron, and camphor. These golden elixirs were said to strengthen the heart and drive away pestilence, though they also caused drowsiness, mild hallucinations, and one very confusing incident involving a bishop, a pigeon, and a sermon delivered in interpretive dance. Interestingly, sleep itself became both a treatment and a warning sign. A good night's sleep was considered a blessing, proof that you were healing. But sleeping too long, that meant death was creeping closer. So people began to fear sleep, even as they chased it with tinctures and teas. You had to rest, but not too deeply. A delicate balance. For those already dying, heavy doses of opiate syrup were often administered, not to cure, but to ease the passage. These were moments of silence amid chaos, where families gathered and watched a loved one drift away peacefully under the soft fog of poppy and prayer. It was one of the few mercies medieval medicine could offer, and in the margins, of course, there were quacks and snake oil vendors selling powders, amulets, and angel's breath tinctures that were mostly just alcohol and mashed up herbs. Some of these did nothing. Others did something, but not what anyone expected. Occasionally, someone would see the light after drinking a blessed wine made of 90% wormwood and honey and proceed to dance naked on a table declaring the plague defeated. Spoiler, it wasn't. All of this created a strange unspoken truth. During the plague, people weren't just fighting infection. They were fighting fear. And anything that dulled that fear, even briefly, was sacred. Whether it came in the form of a priest's blessing, a mother's soup, or a muddy bottle of herbal wine passed from trembling hand to trembling hand, it was embraced. So as you drift into the quieter corners of your thoughts tonight, imagine a small shuttered room. Outside the world groans, but inside a candle flickers low. A cup of warm spiced syrup is passed between loved ones. The taste is bitter, the comfort deep, and for a few hours, time softens, pain lifts, and sleep finally arrives, gentle, sweet, and full of dreams, untouched by plague. Let's stay just a little longer in the strange twilight where medicine madness and mystery blend together. Because tonight, we waltz into one of the weirdest corners of medieval intoxication, the dances of madness. You may have heard of the infamous dancing plagues. Yes, actual historical events, where dozens, sometimes hundreds of people suddenly began to dance uncontrollably in streets, churches, and marketplaces. They danced until they collapsed. Sometimes they danced until they died. Sounds like the Middle Ages trying to throw a rave without a DJ, right? But here's where things get interesting. Many of these episodes weren't just mass hysteria. Modern historians suspect that at least some were caused by ergot, poisoning a fungus that grows on rye and other cereal grains, especially in damp conditions. And what does ergot do? Oh, just causes hallucinations, muscle spasms, convulsions, and intense euphoria. It's a close chemical cousin to LSD. Yes, really. So imagine this. It's late summer in a quiet village. The bread from last month's harvest has started to taste strange. A few people report feeling dizzy after dinner. One woman sees the Virgin Mary in her stew. A boy swears he heard his loaf of bread whisper his name. And then suddenly, people are dancing, wild, frenzied eyes, wide arms flailing, no music, no explanation. These weren't isolated cases. One of the most famous outbreaks occurred in 1518 in Strasbourg, where dozens of people danced for days in the blazing sun, some collapsing from exhaustion, others dying of strokes or heart attacks. Local authorities brought in musicians thinking maybe the afflicted just needed to get it out of their system. Spoiler-adding drums didn't help. But episodes like this happened earlier too, particularly in regions where poor grain storage and heavy rains led to moldy, fungus-ridden rye. Villagers would unknowingly bake their harvest into ergot-laced loaves and feed them to entire families. Symptoms varied, but often included vivid dreams, crawling sensations under the skin, and that irresistible twitchy need to move. This wasn't just dancing. It was ecstatic, unstoppable motion fueled by neurological chaos. And because no one in the Middle Ages had heard of serotonin receptors or alkaloids, they turned to the explanations they did have: demonic possession, divine punishment, or a saint's curse. Some called it St. Vitus's dance, named after a martyred saint believed to protect against nervous disorders. Pilgrims began to visit chapels dedicated to Vitus, hoping for a cure, or at least to outdance their affliction. Monasteries near these sites often developed reputations for their miracle tonics, many of which included, you guessed it, herbal sedatives, poppy syrup, and blessed water steeped in calming herbs, which sometimes worked, and sometimes just made you dance sleepily. Others interpreted the dancing as a spiritual trance. In certain regions, local mystics claimed the afflicted were being temporarily touched by God, their bodies overtaken by divine energy. This wasn't entirely far-fetched. After all, similar trance dancing occurred in some Christian ecstatic traditions, as well as in mystic Islam and pagan rites. Was it neurological? Yes. But it was also interpreted, which gave it power. There's even evidence that in some areas, ritual dancing began as a prevention method. People believed that by voluntarily dancing on St. Vitus's feast day, often after drinking strong wine and inhaling scented herbs, they could avoid being cursed later. Picture a town square full of nervous villagers doing synchronized grape stomping while giggling and chewing valerian leaves. Oddly festive, but not entirely ineffective. And ergot wasn't the only culprit behind these outbreaks of wild behavior. Other forms of food contamination, exhaustion, malnutrition, and yes, herbal experimentation all contributed to a medieval environment where a collective break from reality wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Because remember, life was hard. The church controlled your calendar taxes, controlled your purse, and you were one harvest away from disaster at all times. So when someone offered you a sip of vision wine or a slice of dream bread, you didn't ask too many questions. You took the edge off. And sometimes the edge took you. There are also tales of entire festivals built around this need for release. Seasonal feasts like Carnival or Midsummer Solstice were notorious for wild behavior. Food, drink, music, and herbal infusions created temporary pockets of chaotic joy. People donned masks, danced through the streets, drank from communal vats of heavily spiced mead, and let the normal rules of society blur just for a little while. Some of these events were laced with substances that altered perception. Strong ciders infused with yarrow or sage or ceremonial cakes made with mugwort could shift moods and create a sense of unity or confusion or both. Did people know they were getting high? Maybe not consciously, but they knew something felt different, lighter, stranger, safer. And here's the fascinating part. Many of these altered states were not feared. They were embraced, even celebrated. Yes, if things got too weird, like someone trying to baptize a sheep or claim marriage to a moonbeam, they might end up in the stocks. But mild intoxication was a fact of life, a part of ritual, of healing, of survival. Madness and mysticism often wore the same robe. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine a village lit by firelight and humming with drums. People move together, laughing and spinning the air thick with spices and smoke. No one asks why the stars are dancing or why the shadows are singing. It doesn't matter. For one fleeting night, the world bends, the weight lifts, and the rhythm carries them somewhere just beyond the edge of waking. As we drift deeper into the surreal side of medieval consciousness, let's turn now to the dreamers, the visionaries, and the saintly scribblers, those whose highs were divinely sanctioned, or at least conveniently unexplained. Because among all the herbs and elixirs, there's one group of people who regularly reported vivid, mind-bending experiences while claiming absolutely zero knowledge of intoxicants, the mystics. That's right, we're talking about stone saints and holy visions. The Middle Ages were full of people who experienced what we might now call altered states of consciousness, visions, out-of-body journeys, ecstatic trances, divine whispers, and many of these were chalked up to holiness, not hallucination. But when you take a closer look at what they were doing, eating and breathing, things get a bit suspicious. Let's start with Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess composer, theologian, and one-woman cosmic light show. Hildegard famously described luminous visions, divine music, and the living light, a blinding mystical presence that poured knowledge directly into her brain, like some kind of celestial TED Talk. She even painted some of these visions mandala-like swirls, fiery wheels, strange figures glowing with stars. Was it God? Quite possibly. Was it also a combination of fasting, sleep deprivation, mild epilepsy, and a diet that included wormwood sage and wine-infused herbs? Also yes. Scholars today debate whether Hildegard's visions were purely spiritual, purely neurological, or somewhere in the pleasant, foggy middle. But what's certain is that she experienced something. And it wasn't boring, and she wasn't alone. Take Julian of Norwich, another English mystic who experienced what she called showings, a polite 14th century way of saying, I saw things that made my monk friend drop his spoon. During a severe illness, she reported seeing visions of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and symbolic imagery so abstract it could double as early surrealist poetry. And what was she given to treat that illness? Why, a warm broth infused with herbs and wine? Naturally, fasting was also a big part of the mystic lifestyle. And let's be clear, fasting can get weird. Combine long-term caloric deprivation with sleep interruptions, constant chanting, and maybe a whiff of frankincense every 6 hours, and the brain starts to improvise. One nun might receive divine instructions via a glowing dove. Another might feel the stigmata while gazing at a particularly intense sunset. A third might be halfway into a trance, staring at a wall, murmuring theology that suspiciously rhymes. Now add in the herbal context. These women and a few men often lived in cloisters surrounded by carefully tended gardens. Their diets and medicines included angelica lavender, valerian hyssop, and sometimes poppy extract in syrup. None of these were viewed as recreational, but when combined with austerity and a focus on the divine, you get liftoff. What's remarkable is that these altered states were encouraged to a point. Religious authorities didn't dismiss mystical visions outright. On the contrary, visions were valuable. They offered proof of divine connection. The church loved a good miracle, especially if it could be written down, illustrated, and circulated. What they didn't love was when the visions started veering into territory, like God told me to start a cult, or the Virgin told me taxes are theft. That's when the mystic got quietly relocated. There were even formal procedures to evaluate visions. Was the mystic humble? Were they literate? Did their visions match theology? Did they eat suspicious soup? The night before, the church walked a fine line, wanting saints, but not too many ecstatic freethinkers wandering around blessing pigeons. Still, ecstasy was a valued state. Many mystics wrote about feeling their souls leave their bodies. Some levitated during prayer. Others claimed to smell roses or feel warmth when encountering the divine. These sensory distortions closely mirror the effects of mild hallucinogens and spiritual trances found in other cultures, just dressed up in ecclesiastical Latin and accompanied by a really tight wimple. There were even mystics who intentionally combined sensory deprivation with incense and chanting, essentially creating medieval sensory chambers. They didn't call it biohacking, they called it the anchor hold. These were small stone cells attached to churches where anchorites, usually women, lived alone in near silence. They fasted, prayed, and inhaled whatever the local priest happened to be burning during morning mass. And let's not forget, the saints who spoke in tongues saw angels or experienced moments of holy fire. Today, some of those cases might be read as seizures, or perhaps trauma responses, or again, ergot. But in their time, they were revered. And while not all of them were nibbling herb-laced wafers on the side, it's worth noting that visionary bread and wine were absolutely a thing in certain convents. Perhaps the most fascinating part of all this is the lack of suspicion. No one asked whether Hildegard was microdosing mugwort. No one double-checked Julian's herbal infusions. Their experiences were real because they were ineffable. You couldn't measure them, so you accepted them. And to be fair, they were real for them. Whether chemically induced or spiritually sparked, these visions shaped theology, inspired art, and created some of the most moving religious texts of the Middle Ages. So as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to blur, imagine a candlelit chapel. A woman kneels alone, her eyes half close the air, thick with incense. She's eaten little, slept less. A single note hums from her lips, and then, in the silence, something unfolds, a warmth, a color, a voice, not her own. And for one floating moment, she is somewhere else entirely. Now let's descend into the smoky, sulfur-scented basement of medieval curiosity, the mysterious world of alchemy, where the pursuit of gold immortality and cosmic wisdom blended with just enough exposure to mercury to make your teeth fall out. And if you think the alchemists weren't getting high while they hunted for the philosopher's stone, well, let's say it wasn't just their lab beakers that were bubbling over. Alchemy was a blend of early chemistry, mysticism, medicine, and wild optimism. It involved grinding, distilling, dissolving, and boiling all manner of ingredients, herbs, metals, salts, and animal parts, often for days at a time. Alchemists believed that matter could be purified through these processes just like the soul, which sounds noble, until you realize they were inhaling mercury fumes and sipping tinctures of antimony in the process. Let's begin with their signature move, distillation. Medieval alchemists were among the first to systematically extract the essence of plants and minerals. Using a tool called an alembic, they could heat a substance, capture its vapors, and condense those vapors back into liquid. This led to incredibly concentrated forms of everything from alcohol to wormwood opium, belladonna, and henbane. These distilled substances were used to make elixirs, potions, thought to prolong life, increase wisdom, or unlock hidden truths. And yes, they were very much consumed by the alchemists themselves. Why give your magical moon water to a noble when you could test it on yourself and have a deep, heartfelt conversation with your crucible about the nature of time? One of the more famous pursuits in alchemical tradition was the elixir of life, or elixir vitae, a substance that would supposedly grant immortality, or at least extend human lifespan. Recipes varied wildly, but many included poppy derivatives, alcoholic wine bases, and metallic tinctures that probably did more to shorten one's life than lengthen it. Still, imagine sipping a spicy little mercury cocktail and thinking, I bet this'll cure my aging. Then waking up 2 days later with glowing cheeks and mild memory loss. Then there was philosophical mercury, a mythical version of mercury believed to be the pure essence of transformation. To get close to it, alchemists sometimes worked with the real stuff. And what happens when you spend too much time around mercury vapor? Cognitive issues, tremors, hallucinations, and a sudden belief that your cat is a messenger from the astral realm. Mercury poisoning was common among alchemists, and while tragic, it did lend itself to some pretty inspired interpretations of scripture and glowing rocks. Not all alchemical ingredients were lethal. Some were familiar: myrrh, frankincense, nutmeg, and mugwort all found their way into recipes, often mixed with wine and heated over coals. These potions were tested during meditation or ritual, sometimes as part of a purification, fast, or celestial alignment, which is to say, it wasn't just science, it was performance art. And the performers were definitely vibing. Alchemists were also obsessed with transmutation, the idea that base metals could be turned into gold. This wasn't entirely about wealth. It symbolized the transformation of the soul. But along the way, it also involved burning lead, dissolving copper, and inhaling things that made your teeth hum. If the spirit didn't ascend, the smoke certainly did. And yes, they shared. Nobles often patronized alchemists and sampled their potions. Monks recorded alchemical experiments alongside recipes for herbal wine. Some early physicians got their start dabbling in alchemy, creating tonics that were basically medieval cocktails, equal parts medicine, alcohol, and hopeful guessing. One well-known figure, Paracelsus, straddled the line between physician and alchemist. He promoted the use of tinctures over crude herbs and believed that distillation was the future of medicine. He once claimed that opium carefully prepared was the closest thing to a divine cure humans would ever touch. He also once declared, "What is poison? All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dosage alone makes it so a thing is not a poison," which sounds profound until you realize he was probably saying it to his reflection in a beaker. Alchemy's secretive nature meant a lot of its recipes were wrapped in symbolism. A green lion devouring the sun might refer to aqua regia, a highly corrosive acid. Dragon's blood might mean powdered resin. White queen floating in Red Sea could mean, well, it depends who's translating and how much wormwood they've had. But the bottom line, these people were high, not all the time, not all on purpose, but regularly enough that alchemical texts sometimes read less like lab reports and more like acid-fueled poetry. They weren't afraid of strange effects, they chased them. They believed that if your mind cracked open wide enough, something eternal might pour in. Or at least the secret to making gold out of eggshells. And unlike mystics or monks, alchemists were supposed to flirt with the edge of perception. They weren't bound by religious doctrine or humble poverty. They were half scholars, half sorcerers, chemists with a flair for the theatrical and a deeply relaxed attitude toward personal safety. So as you drift now into your own quiet transformation, picture a shadowy stone chamber lit by flickering flames. Bottles clink softly. A figure in a hood leans over a steaming glass coil. Outside, the world turns slowly. Inside, the air is thick with lavender wine and something strange you can't quite name. The alchemist takes a sip, exhales, and writes, "It is beginning. The gold is within." After all the strange brews, swirling incense, and highly questionable mushrooms, we arrive at an important but often overlooked question. How did they come down? Or more accurately, did they come down at all? Because for every medieval person who floated off on a cloud of poppy wine and thyme smoke, there eventually came a morning after. And oh, what a morning it could be. Let's talk about the medieval hangover, the long wobbly tale of intoxication dragged behind the festive peasant, the drowsy monk, the mystically overwhelmed nun, or the noble who woke up hugging a harpsichord. These weren't just physical come-downs, they were spiritual, existential, and in some cases, permanent. First, the basics. Medieval people did recognize the concept of being over-refreshed. They called it things like over-merriment, spiritual fatigue, or in one charming English text, the heaviness that follows too much good wine. The symptoms: headache, dizziness, nausea, dry mouth, memory gaps, a sudden urge to pray. Sound familiar? And they had remedies, though not necessarily ones that worked. One popular hangover cure was gruel, a warm, watery porridge meant to settle the stomach and soak up whatever regrettable tincture you had imbibed. Another was vinegar diluted with water, which probably just made your stomach confused and sad. Herbalists recommended peppermint fennel, rosemary tea, or even a poultice of cabbage leaves applied directly to the forehead, which sounds ridiculous, until you remember that aspirin hadn't been invented yet. For wealthier folks, a morning cordial might be served lightly infused wine spiked with ginger honey and a dash of, well, whatever wasn't nailed down. The idea was to gently reintroduce stimulation to the system without relapsing into full-blown musical hallucinations. Monks, interestingly, had their own recovery rituals. A monk who'd overindulged perhaps in the name of medicinal experimentation, of course, might be sent to the herb garden for extra work, where the fresh air and manual labor would sweat the sin out. Others were given herbal infusions of betony or lemon balm to restore clarity. Though one suspects that many simply went back to sleep behind the scriptorium shelves until someone rang the bell for dinner. For peasants, there wasn't much time to nurse a hangover. You got up, you fed the animals, and you tried not to vomit into the well. But some communities had local folk remedies passed down through generations. A strong brew of nettles and elderflower, for example, was said to chase the ghosts out of your head. Others swore by chewing raw garlic. And if that didn't work, you blamed the moon and carried on. Now some never truly came down at all. Those who became dependent on certain substances, especially opium or nightshade-based salves, could fall into what medieval writers described as the long sleep or the forgetting. These were people who drifted through life in a fog, unable to rouse themselves to full awareness. Today, we might describe this as addiction or long-term neurological effects. Back then, it was seen as a kind of spiritual fading, a slow withdrawal from the world, possibly divine, possibly tragic. In monasteries and healing centers, these cases were treated with concern. Patients were given purifying diets, long walks, prayer sessions, and doses of cleansing herbs like rusage or bitter apple, which often caused intense vomiting. The idea was to expel the imbalance from the body one way or another. And let's not forget the emotional hangover. For many, an intense experience, whether through dream herbs, ecstatic visions, or accidental mushroom overdoses, left them with a sense of disconnection. Reality felt dull. The everyday world, with its muddy streets and strict fasts, couldn't compare to the luminous warmth of a well-timed poppy dream. That's why mystics often chased their visions again and again, not for the thrill, but for the sense of rightness they found there. Some responded by retreating further into prayer or fasting. Others sought out new herbs, new brews, new healers. And a few turned away from it, entirely frightened by what they'd seen or how far they'd slipped. Medieval literature is full of stories where someone goes too far, encounters a dazzling truth, and returns changed, quiet, withdrawn, or humming to themselves in the cabbage patch. Still, the goal for many wasn't to stay high. It was to touch something divine, mysterious, or simply less muddy than real life, and then return with a new sense of self. The re-entry was part of the ritual. Some came back with insights, others came back with a limp, and some, well, they were found asleep in the barn 3 days later. But the return was essential. In fact, medieval rituals often included a grounding phase, a simple meal, a cold cloth on the forehead, a quiet chant, or even a walk through the woods. These weren't just recovery tools. They were acknowledgments that the journey, whatever it had been, was over, that the soul had landed. So tonight, as we close the door on this fragrant, flickering, faintly dangerous world, imagine a quiet morning after. A monk sips rosemary tea on a garden bench. A noble blinks at the sunlight, still unsure why he's wearing chainmail pajamas. A peasant shrugs, grabs his hoe, and says, "Well, that was something." And somewhere, a forgotten bottle sits on a shelf, half full of something dark and sweet. No label, just a scent rich with spice and memory, waiting for the next curious hand to lift it. And now, as the candles gutter low and the night air settles around us, it's time to step quietly away from the potions, powders, and perfumed dreams of the medieval world. You've wandered through taverns, humming with herbal laughter, slipped past monastic halls, where incense thickened the air like honey, and strolled down the dusty roads of pilgrims, whose visions shimmered just out of reach. You've watched nobles drink gold-dusted wine, peasants chew wild roots with a shrug, and alchemists lean a little too close to the fumes. You've seen the delicate dance between medicine and mystery, between survival and surrender, and between what the Middle Ages called divine and what we might now call chemical. But there was beauty in the blur. In a time when life was short and often brutal, people reached for anything that softened the edges. Whether in prayer, in plants, or in potions, they searched for moments of stillness, for insight, for escape. And now, as your breath deepens and your limbs grow warm and heavy beneath your blanket, imagine the world slowing to a hush. The taverns are quiet, the monks are asleep. The moon watches gently from behind a drifting cloud. Somewhere, a garden of strange herbs sighs in the breeze, and a small wooden cup sits untouched beside a dreaming figure. The night holds no questions now, only silence soft and slow, and the peaceful echo of a history not quite forgotten. Sleep well, and if you dream of floating gently above a medieval village with a goose in one hand and a tankard in the other, well, don't worry. That's probably just the mugwort.